The year is 332 BC. Alexander the Great has just crushed the massive Persian army at Issus. He marches his unstoppable army down the Mediterranean coast, taking city after city with ease, until he reaches Tyre, the crown jewel of Phoenicia. But there is a massive problem. Tyre isn't just a walled city. It's an island fortress sitting half a mile out in the sea, and its defensive walls? A staggering 150 feet high, facing the water. Like any reasonable conqueror, Alexander sends messengers. "Surrender, and I'll spare you." The Tyrians look down at Alexander standing on the beach without a single warship. They laugh, kill his messengers, and throw them off the high walls into the sea. "You can't touch us, farm boy," they probably shouted. They felt completely untouchable. For any normal military general in history, this is where the campaign ends. You simply cannot lay siege to a fortified island without a navy. It is absolute military suicide. But Alexander isn't a normal general. He is a stubborn megalomaniac with a point to prove. He gathers his top engineers, marches down to the beach, and points directly at the sea. "If we don't have a navy to cross the sea, we will turn the sea into land." He ordered his men to build a massive bridge of rock and timber across half a mile of ocean, the legendary Mole of Tyre. The plan was simple in theory, but absolute madness in execution. They would build a land bridge 200 feet wide reaching the island. To get the millions of tons of rock needed, Alexander's men literally tore apart the abandoned mainland city of Old Tyre, stone by stone. Thousands of soldiers and forced laborers carried these heavy rocks to the water, dumping them in to create a solid foundation. For timber, they marched to the nearby mountains of Lebanon, chopping down thousands of ancient cedar trees to act as wooden piles. These massive wooden logs were driven deep into the thick sea mud, holding the piles of loose rock together against the ocean currents. At first, progress was incredibly fast. The water near the mainland was shallow, and the bottom was soft mud. Alexander himself supervised the work, handing out gold coins and gifts to the hardest-working men to boost their morale. But as the causeway crept closer to the island, everything changed. The seafloor suddenly dropped out. Near the island's walls, the water was 18 feet deep, and the ocean currents here were violent. Men would throw massive boulders into the sea, only to watch them vanish into the deep blue without making a dent. To make matters worse, the Tyrians realized what Alexander was doing. They sailed out in small, fast boats to harass the workers. Because the Macedonians were busy carrying rocks, they couldn't defend themselves. The Tyrians rained arrows down on them. The workers had to cower behind whatever they could find. Construction became a deadly nightmare. Progress slowed to a crawl. Alexander knew his men would be slaughtered if they kept working totally exposed. So he ordered the construction of 2 enormous wooden siege towers, pushed right to the very front edge of the mole. 2 massive wooden siege towers, towering 150 feet high, were erected at the very edge of the mole. Covered in animal hides to protect against fire arrows, these towers provided the perfect shield. The workers could finally resume building safely. From their high walls, the Tyrians watched in horror as the land bridge crept closer and closer to their island. Alexander smiled. His impossible engineering marvel was actually working. Victory seemed just days away. But the Tyrians were master seafarers. If they couldn't stop the rocks, they would destroy the towers. They took an old horse transport ship and packed it to the brim with dry wood, pitch, sulfur, and whatever would burn. On the masts, they hung giant iron cauldrons filled with highly flammable oil. Waiting for the perfect wind, Tyrian sailors rowed this floating bomb directly toward the Macedonian siege towers. Just before impact, they set the ship ablaze and dove into the sea, swimming back to safety. The fire ship smashed violently into the end of the mole. The impact snapped the masts. The cauldrons shattered, spilling blazing oil all over the wooden siege towers. The animal hides couldn't withstand the intense chemical fire. Within minutes, the 150-foot towers were completely engulfed in flames. Macedonian engineers panicked, jumping into the water to escape the inferno as the massive structures collapsed. To add insult to injury, Tyrians rowed out in small boats to smash the remaining wooden piles and tear down the rocks. Months of grueling labor, millions of tons of rock, and his prized siege towers, all reduced to ashes in a single afternoon. Most men would have given up. But Alexander realized a cold, hard truth. To beat an island, you need ships. Leaving his engineers to rebuild the mole, he temporarily left the siege and traveled to the nearby city of Sidon. There, a stroke of massive geopolitical luck happened. The kings of Cyprus and Phoenicia had heard of his earlier victories. Realizing the Persian Empire was crumbling, these kings defected. And they didn't just bring their loyalty, they brought their fleets. Within days, Alexander went from having 0 ships to commanding a massive armada of 223 warships. With his new navy at his back, Alexander sailed back to Tyre. It was time for payback. Meanwhile, the Tyrians were still celebrating on their walls, thinking they had won the war by burning the mole. Then, one of them looked out at the horizon. The entire sea was covered in sails. Alexander's new armada had arrived, entirely blocking the horizon. The Tyrian fleet, severely outnumbered, immediately retreated behind their harbor walls and blocked the entrances with sunken ships. Alexander didn't force a naval battle. Instead, he positioned his massive fleet to completely blockade both of Tyre's harbors. The tables had turned. The Impregnable island fortress was now a giant, walled prison. With the sea under his control, Alexander ordered the land bridge to be rebuilt, and this time he made it wider and stronger. Protected by their massive naval blockade, the Macedonian engineers worked relentlessly. The bridge slowly swallowed the ocean. Soon, Alexander was literally knocking on their front door. The impossible had been achieved. Tyre was no longer an island. Even with the mole completed, breaking through Tyre's towering walls from a single, narrow point on the land bridge was nearly impossible. Alexander knew he needed to attack from multiple angles. Looking at his newly acquired fleet, he had another crazy idea. He ordered his engineers to lash 2 large transport ships together, side by side, to create a massive, stable, floating platform. On top of these platforms, they mounted towering wooden siege engines and enormous, heavy battering rams. This was totally unprecedented. Alexander had just invented the ship-mounted siege tower, slowly rowing them right up to the city walls. The Tyrians, watching giant wooden rams floating toward them across the waves, quickly realized the extreme danger. To stop the ships, they started hurling massive stone blocks from their walls directly into the shallow waters below. These underwater boulders acted as a hidden barrier, completely preventing the Macedonian siege ships from getting close enough to ram the walls. Not to be outdone, Alexander sent specialized crane ships to hook the sunken boulders and drag them away into deep water. But the Tyrians were brilliant defenders. They sent highly trained divers slipping silently into the sea. Swimming underwater, these divers approached the Macedonian crane ships and used sharp knives to slice right through their anchor ropes. Without anchors, the winds and currents immediately pushed Alexander's clearing ships helplessly out to sea. It was a frustrating game of cat and mouse. But Alexander was relentlessly stubborn, and he always adapted. If the Tyrians could easily cut rope, he would give them something they couldn't cut. He replaced all the anchor cables with thick, heavy iron chains. The Tyrian divers were rendered completely useless. The clearing of the rocks resumed. With the underwater obstacles finally gone, Alexander's ship-mounted battering rams reached the walls. For weeks, the heavy iron-tipped logs pounded against the solid stone. Boom, boom, boom. The Tyrians were desperate. To stop the rams, they invented a horrific new defense. superheated sand. They poured boiling, glowing red sand down onto the attackers working the siege engines. The fine sand slipped right through the gaps in their armor, burning their skin and forcing screaming soldiers to dive into the sea. But Alexander wouldn't back down. He tested every inch of the perimeter until he found a weak spot on the southern wall. He concentrated his largest floating rams on this single section, ordering them to pound the stone without stopping. Slowly, hairline cracks began to form in the supposedly impenetrable fortress. The defenders watched in absolute terror as the cracks widened. Their ultimate shield was failing. Alexander ordered his men to push with everything they had. One final strike. The stone groaned, shattered, and a massive section of the southern wall collapsed into the sea. As the dust cleared, a narrow, treacherous breach was revealed. The door to Tyre was finally open. Alexander didn't hesitate. He drew his sword and signaled the all-out assault. The elite Macedonian shock troops swarmed over the wooden gangways and up the rocky rubble, pouring into the breach. After 7 agonizing months of siege, the final bloody battle for Tyre had begun. The clash at the breach was ferociously brutal. Alexander's vanguard, led by a captain named Admetus, was the first to step foot on the wall. Admetus was instantly killed by a Tyrian spear, but his sacrifice allowed the rest of the Macedonian elite troops to secure the position. The fighting spilled into the narrow, winding streets of Tyre. Defenders fought from the rooftops, hurling stones and weapons down on the invaders. Alexander himself was at the forefront of the carnage, his royal cape stained with the dust and chaos of the close-quarters combat. While the defenders were distracted by the breach, Alexander's fleet finally smashed through the chains blocking both the northern and southern harbors. The remaining Tyrian ships were trapped and destroyed. Macedonian forces poured into the city from all sides. The trap was sprung. Realizing the city had fallen, the Tyrian king and his highest-ranking nobles fled to the sacred temple of Melkart for sanctuary. Outside, the rest of the city was offered no quarter. The Macedonians, exhausted and enraged from 7 months of torture, unleashed their absolute fury. The slaughter was unimaginable. Thousands of Tyrian soldiers and civilians were cut down in the streets and alleys. Alexander reached the temple of Melkart. Because he respected the gods, he granted full pardons to the king and everyone hiding inside. But for the rest of Tyre, Alexander's wrath was apocalyptic. The streets ran with the aftermath of his vengeance. Historians estimate that 8,000 Tyrians were killed during the final assault alone. 30,000 citizens of Tyre, men, women, and children, were rounded up in chains and sold into slavery. However, the true horror of Alexander's punishment was reserved for the soldiers who had dared to mock him from their walls. And as a final, chilling message to the world, Alexander ordered 2,000 Tyrian men to be crucified along the length of the sandy beach. The next morning, the sun rose over a completely changed landscape. Alexander had done what the world thought was physically impossible. Word of the island's brutal fall sent absolute shockwaves throughout the rest of the Persian Empire. If Alexander could literally move the ocean to destroy Tyre, no city was safe. Most of the remaining coastal fortresses simply surrendered without a fight. By the time he marched his army into Egypt, the people didn't even try to resist. They welcomed him as a liberator and literally crowned him pharaoh. But the most fascinating legacy of the Siege of Tyre wasn't political or military. It was geographical. When Alexander built his massive half-mile stone causeway, he accidentally altered the ocean's natural currents. Over the next few centuries, sand and sediment naturally began to build up against the submerged rocks of the bridge. Slowly, the sea was filled in permanently. Tyre was never an island again. Even today, over 2,000 years later, the modern Lebanese city of Tyre sits comfortably on a massive peninsula, a peninsula that was built completely on top of Alexander's ancient wooden piles and sunken rocks. Alexander the Great didn't just defeat an army or conquer a city. He was so unbelievably stubborn and determined, he actually defeated Mother Nature. He changed the actual map of the Earth just to prove a point to a king who wouldn't surrender. And that is exactly why, in the brutal history of ancient warfare, he is remembered forever as the Great.